Hey, Kathy, I'm going to test my headset. Can you hear me okay?
We're having a problem with Kathy's sound, so I'm on the phone on that. I can hear you.
But you can hear me. Okay, good.
And can you guys see or hear me?
We can see and hear you perfectly. How are you?
Perfect. Great. Thank you.
Great. I understand you're abroad.
I am. I'm in Switzerland. So.
How lovely.
Yeah, I really kind of missed this meeting, so that's why I wanted to dial in. But thanks for your patience with my connectivity and stuff. So.
No, it's perfect, but I would be tempted to look at the Alps instead of dialing into an FPDR board meeting. But
well, luckily it's late at night. It's around 10 o'clock right now.
Oh yeah, I guess that's true. That's true. Nothing to see.
Exactly. So in that case, I'm going to turn off the camera for now to save bandwidth and stuff.
Yep. Hi, Trustee McClowry. How are you?
I'm fine,
Chair Carter. Hi, Chair Carter. How are you? Oh, you're muted. Just so you know.
Now, how are you?
Good.
Great.
I think Sam is dealing with some sound issues with Kathy or something, or open signal. Anyway.
Stacey, I have to tell you something about the names.
give Kyle a few minutes to brag about himself and say what you're from and how long you've been working for the Fire Bureau at the city.
Sure, it'll be short, I'm sure. I think before I introduce myself, I think probably it'd be appropriate to just take a minute to thank my predecessor, Jason. I'm sure you all know Jason, and I had a chance to read the minutes, and whoever takes the minutes for these meetings does a fantastic job. But I know that there was some nice words said about him, and as the person who's replacing him from the Fire Bureau, really need to just state officially how thankful we are for his service in 9 years on the board. It'll take me quite a long time, I think, to get to his level of knowledge of the things that you are all involved with on this board. But you know, I have a big learning curve, so I'm looking forward to learning. But just a quick thanks and appreciation for Jason. So I'm originally from the East Coast. I'm from Maryland, but I've been out here in Portland for a good 30 years. And I've been working for Portland Fire and Rescue for over 15 as a line firefighter. I'm still working on the line. I did have, Jason was a vice president of Local 43, and I'm not currently an executive board member, but I was a vice president for 3 years from 2017 to 2020. And board committee members and the district rep for years before that. So I think some of that experience and knowledge that I have from that time really dovetail nicely with some of the issues that will happen, knowledge that I'll have to learn on this board. So I think that's kind of it. I am currently working up in the West Hills at Station 15, which is over on Spring and Vista across from Ainsworth Elementary School. And I'm just happy to be here and listen and try and start soaking in some of the issues that I have to learn about for the next few years. So that's my little introduction. Thank you, Sam.
So it is time for approval of the minutes. If you want to go ahead with that.
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes.
Motion is made. May I have a second? Carter, second.
I second.
The minutes have been approved. Are there any questions? Thank you. Sam, I think I'm kind of off here because I'm not looking at my agenda. I'm looking at other things here. Since you have that agenda close to you, Sam, what's next on there?
That's introduction of visitors. So just for the newer people on the board, typically when we met in person, you'd have people sitting around the room and we just ask everybody to introduce themselves. So anybody who's not on the board, just want to go down the list, just really quickly state your name and what you do and potentially why you're here today. Stacy, you want to go first?
Yep, I'll kick us off. I'm Stacy Jones, and I'm the Deputy Director and the Pension and Finance Manager for Fire and Police Disability and Retirement, FPDR.
Kim, you're up next on my list of pictures.
Great, I'll unmute there. Hi, I'm Kim Mitchell. I'm the FPDR Disability Claims Manager. Welcome, everybody.
And Kathy, you want to go? Kakisako?
Hi, I am Kathy Kakisako, the FPDR Senior Legal Assistant.
And she's the one you'll be receiving a lot of emails and stuff from. So she's your main communication standpoint with the Bureau. If you have any questions about meetings or other or information that's sent to or information you need, she's one of the first people you go to. Then we have Julie Hall.
Is Julie there?
Good afternoon. I was muted, sorry. Hi, I'm the front desk receptionist.
Hello there, I'm Julie Crisp, and I am the systems analyst for the Bureau. I help with the database systems and also everything technical. Nice to meet you all.
So for technical, she's the one to help us make sure the Zoom and stuff works and if there's any issues with that. Then we have Lauren. You want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Lauren Downhoward. I'm a shareholder with Ogletree Deacons in Portland, and I am the outside legal counsel for benefits and tax issues.
And Lauren will join in occasionally when we have certain issues, especially for tax, pension, and a few other things like that. He is the board's attorney as such, so we contract out with him to provide additional legal services, both the FPDR and the board. And Franco, our city attorney, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, Franco Luchin. I'm with the city attorney's office, and I advise and represent FPDR.
Okay. I think that's everybody have. And the other two on our open signal, they're the ones that help us with the closed captioning and getting this streamed online. So they're just there observing what we're doing. So thank you to them for the help there. The next part on the agenda is public comment period. Kathy, anybody signed up to discuss?
Nope, there's no signups for public comment.
Okay, and just
Is that good or bad, Sam?
that's neutral. It just means they do have opportunities to, and I don't know if there will be anybody that's to talk about each particular item on the agenda as we go through it. This is pretty straightforward. We don't get a whole lot of people. I think usually when we have starting in March, you'll do the annual cost of living amount. You'll see people pop up, want to talk and have their opinions heard on that. And there's sometimes other topics that will come in. And just again, for the newer people, when Kathy will send out a meeting announcement, she has a huge distribution list that this goes out to. I think she's got 60 or some odd people or more on the list. And then she posts it in some other locations, and people are invited to contact her if they want to join in this meeting and offer any testimony to do that. If this was in person, there's clipboards where they sign in, but here they just let Kathy know, and then she'll get them set up so they can come into the Zoom, and nobody has done that for this time.
I guess nothing is controversial enough for that to happen.
Well, the hard part is what's controversial is in the eye of the beholder. There's times we've gone through the agenda, we thought it's nice and clean, and we spend 3 hours on a topic. So it all depends upon it. And, you know, sometimes the board members want to go into in-depth discussion, which is good. So you can't always tell on the agenda what's going to take a lot of time and not. So the next area is action items. I want to, before we go, and I'm addressing this to everybody here, is, you know, Chair Carter asked that we explain acronyms. I'm going to put a lot of burden on the board people. Ask questions if you don't understand what we're doing. You're new. The staff, Stacy and I are going to do most of the presenting today. We know an awful lot. Sometimes we may not understand that you don't know what we're talking about. So ask questions, stop us if you don't understand what we're talking about. We don't want to move or bulldoze over you without you understanding what we're doing. So we'll stop and answer any question you have with that. And I think speaking of Stacy, she's the first one up to talk about the 2022 to 2023 budget. We're looking for it to be adopted. Go for it, Stacy.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Again, I'm Stacy Jones, and I am here today in my capacity as the finance manager. So I'm going to go through budget presentation. And I know since we have 3 new board members, I'll kind of go over more of the basics than I normally would with the budget. So I'll just ask Trustee McLeod to bear with me because she's heard it all before. And as Sam said, please chime in with questions. It's easier for me if you just interrupt me and talk than it is for me to monitor the chat and look for raised hands. But if Julie Hall and Kathy could keep an eye on the chat and the raised hands, then let me know if there's anything in there and I'll stop. All right, so I'm going to share my screen so we can go ahead and flip through the presentation. Let me know if everybody can see it. Let me try to get that full screen for us. All right. Is everybody able to see okay? Yep, okay, great. All right, sorry, like I said, I can't. I've got your things up now next to me, so I can see some of you nodding and smiling. All right, so it's time for the board to adopt the annual budget for the next fiscal year. And like most local governments, our fiscal year runs from July 1st to June 30. So we are adopting the budget for July 1st, 2022 through June 30, 2023. So what I have for you today is the staff recommended budget. We'll go through it, see if the board feels comfortable approving that budget today, or if you want to see some changes, and then you would approve it. So let me tell you a little bit about the board's role with the budget vis-a-vis City Council. So you are the only board in the city, well, I should say the only board of a city bureau that has the exclusive authority to adopt the budget. So City Council does not have the authority to set the budget for FPDR. That is the province of the board. So that's what you're going to do today. However, our main revenue source is a dedicated property tax levy, and only council can levy a tax. So city charter requires them to levy a tax sufficient to fund the budget that you all approve today. So that's how we connect to city council. But because we are part of the city, we are a city bureau, and state local budget law, we manage a city fund, and state local budget law requires council to adopt a budget for all city funds. We will go through kind of the rest. We'll go through the citywide budget process along with all the other bureaus in the city. But the board has the exclusive authority to set the budget. So that process for the rest of the city is that tomorrow we will turn this budget, whatever budget you guys approve with or without changes, we'll turn that budget into the city budget office tomorrow. And then it'll, just kind of ride along with the other bureaus and be included in the final budget that will be adopted in June. And then council will levy a tax that is enough to hopefully raise enough money for us to go forward with the budget that you approve. So in addition to next year's budget, I always prepare a forecast for the next 5 fiscal years. And we want to do that just to make sure that we're thinking adequately ahead. We're going to talk, mostly about the budget because that's what you need to adopt. But I'm also going to now and then talk about what I think is going to happen over the next 5 fiscal years. So we keep an eye on what's coming up ahead. There are additional materials in your budget or in your board books behind this presentation. Not going to go through those materials, but let me at least explain to you what they are. These are some, but not all of the documents that we are required to submit as part of the citywide budget process. The first document, which is 9 pages long, gives an overview of the Bureau and how it fits into the city, plus some performance measures and spending for the last 2 years, as well as projected performance measure values and budget for this year and the next year. It'll also show you the staffing that we currently have and proposed staffing in fiscal year 22-23. The second document, which is 4 pages long, looks at the budget and spending through the lens of the operating fund. Again, with spending for the last 2 years, as well as projected spending and budget for this year and next year. So it's really the same numbers, but looked at through the lens of a fund rather than through a department, because we also manage our own fund. We live outside the general fund. The third document, which is 2 pages long, does the same thing for our reserve fund, because we do have a second little tiny reserve fund, $750,000 in there. It's not very exciting. And then the last document gives a more detailed look at each of FPDR's sort of operating programs, budgetarily speaking. It'll walk you through the disability benefits program, the pension benefits program, the PERS contributions program, and administration and support with a variety of kind of narrative and about programs and budgets and staffing and FTEs. So Trustee McLeod, you might notice that that material is a little bit different from the past, because in the past we've given the board essentially a very lengthy Word document that tries to go over the budget and the 5-year forecast. But this year we're trying something new. We wanted you to have the same materials that council gets. So should you come across our budget elsewhere in the world, it will not look unfamiliar to you. We've never been able to do that before because of the city budget publishing software isn't ready when we need to send materials out to you. But this year it was, or at least it was ready enough that we could send you a lot of the same materials that council normally gets. So Trustee McLeod, let me know if you have any questions about how the materials are different from in the past. But I think this is an improvement for you guys to be looking at the same things as council. All right, I know we have a little bit of feedback. I don't know if that's me. Is everybody else hearing a little bit of feedback? I don't know if it's.
I was a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, I just saw Sam muted. That might help. Anyway, okay. Well, we'll just, it is what it is. We'll do the best we can. All right, so moving on to our first slide. I'm really sorry to do this to you on your first slide. This is the most numbers I will force you to look at in one place, I promise. But I want the board to see the entire overview of everything right up front. So what is going on with this table? This is the 5-year forecast summary. So this will have our budget and our 5-year forecast. The first column is actual spending for the last fiscal year, which ended on June 30, 2021. The next column here is the adopted budget for the current fiscal year, which will end June 30, 2022. And our latest projection for revenues and expenses for fiscal year end 2022, which of course will be a little bit different from the budget that we adopted 7 or 8 months ago. This is the staff recommended budget for the next fiscal year end 23. And then this is the forecast for the succeeding 4 fiscal years. And then this column here will show you the percentage change over the entire 5-year forecast period. So you can see how expenses and revenues are growing over the entire 5 years. We have resources, revenues and other assets up here on top, requirements, which just means expenditures down here on the bottom. A row running along the bottom, you'll see obviously that resources and requirements balance as they are required to do. And you'll see running along the bottom a total net of tax anticipation notes. That's what TAN stands for, tax anticipation notes. Since our primary revenue source is property taxes, we issue short-term tax anticipation notes every year. So they're essentially, they're notes, meaning that they are short-term bonds, and we issue them and repay them in the same fiscal year. So including them it artificially inflates the size of our budget. So you'll often see me present our budget net of TANs. And then you can see.
Stacy, one question. So how will this budget, your projections, be affected by the number of COVID cases that have come in?
So we will get to that in just a moment. We'll get to that. We will get to that on future slides, because one of the things that we want to talk about is how the COVID waves impacted our spending, both last year and this year, and then what we've planned for budget-wise next year. But to kind of answer it in a nutshell, we have made it. I'll wait until we go along. But let me know if you still have questions about that at the end. Sure.
I do have.
I have one other question too, and you can get to this in the future. I noticed that the property taxes, are substantially higher in fiscal year 21-22 than they were last year, and that they're projected to be next year. Is that something you're talking about later, or do you want to mention it now?
Yeah, I love that you guys are picking up on all the key issues. We're on slide 1. This is fantastic. But yes, maybe the single most notable thing about this budget is that we're going to drop our property tax revenue ask. And Trustee McLeod, I'll talk about that a lot, but that's because we are sitting on excess fund balance that we built up in cautiousness and nervousness about all the financial risk we were facing. And now I'm feeling comfortable letting go of some of that balance and asking for lower property taxes. So that's kind of the answer in a nutshell.
That plays into the question I was just about to ask as well, if I may. There was a fair amount of discussion in other parts of the document about the beginning fund balance. Can you just briefly explain to me how, you have the total resources and requirements are always even out. How do you end up with a balance at the beginning of each fund year?
So that's, and you'll see up on this slide that beginning fund balance is a resource. So it's always included as a resource up here in the top. And then ending fund balance is always included. It's included as a requirement, which I know doesn't necessarily make sense to non-budget people because it's not an expense. It's really just the money. It's a balancing item to make sure that these two things balance between resources and.
So it's what's left over from the previous year that wasn't spent. Thank you.
Yep. So if you think of it, I guess kind of like a checking account, just imagine with your checking account, you were looking at your fund balance, how much did you have in your checking account on July 1st and how much did you have on June 30? But if we don't spend any of our fund contingency, let me put it this way, if we don't spend any of our fund contingency and all of our other budgets were perfect, we were right on, we spent exactly what we said we were going to spend, we got as much revenue as we thought we were going to get, then contingency, what we'd set aside for contingency would be fund balance. It would just fall to fund balance, be hanging out there for us to use the next year. Does that make sense?
My question was, I thought it doesn't revert back to any sort of general fund. It stays within.
Oh, no.
Okay. Oh, no.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like, oh, no. The general fund never gets any money from us. Well, that's actually not entirely true because we have to pay for citywide services like every other bureau. But no, there's no connection between the general fund and the FPDR. We sit on our money, and the way that we sort of deal with having too much fund balance is to reduce what we ask property tax owners to pay us in the next fiscal year, which is what we will be doing next year. And alternatively, when we don't have enough fund balance, well, we got to ask for a little bit more then. And of course, we do our best to try to manage the fund to sort of stay on an even keel. But when you're living through a period of financial uncertainty, that's a little more difficult than usual.
Thank you.
Any other questions before I move on? All right. So this row down here, I just want to point out, it shows the changes of percent from year to year. And then this very last little cell over here shows the average annual change over the 5 year, the 6.1%. So you can see that net of tax anticipation notes, we have very slight growth for fiscal year in 23 compared to our projection for the current year, just this 1.8%. But I promise you that you will see much heftier growth if we strip out the fund level stuff. I'll call it the fund level stuff. You'll see it in this line here, fund level requirements. This is where everything lives that really doesn't have a lot to do with operating our programs, but has to do with like contingency and fund transfers and those tax anticipation notes flowing in and out, kind of a financial operations line. So if I strip that line out, as I will do on the next slide, you will see that we have much heftier growth in our actual operating expenses, which is probably what you're a little more interested in. And then looking over the whole 5-year forecast, total growth from this year to the 5th fiscal year is about 37.6%. Net of TANs, it's about 34.4%. And then you can see that we're having average annual growth of about 6% a year, which is actually pretty similar to our growth rate over the last 5 years. And maybe this is a good moment for me to remind the board that we are having growth above and beyond sort of usual inflation, and have been for the last 15 years, and will continue to have for the next 15 years at least, because we are transitioning from that pay-as-you-go pension plan for the FPDR 1 and 2 members who are now either retired or halfway through their working careers, and then the pre-funded pension program for our FPDR 3 members who are in PERS. So while we fund those two simultaneously, because with a pay-as-you-go pension, we pay for folks during their retirement years, and with a pre-funded pension, you pay during their working years. So we get that double whammy for a generation, which is why you're going to see tons of expenditure growth at FPDR. Don't worry, part of the plan all along, part of the plan when they adopted that change back in 2006. So to be expected. All right, now I will move on. Sorry, one more slide with a bunch of numbers on it. This one has fewer numbers. This is all of the same numbers as the previous slide, except with a lot fewer years on it. So you can focus on the budget year a little bit more. Again, that's fiscal year in 23. This slide also shows operating expenses running along the bottom line. So it doesn't include things in that fund. I've taken out the fund level requirements up here. So it doesn't include, borrowing and repaying the TANs and fund contingency and et cetera. So you can see that our operating expenses are growing, closer to 8% overall. And we'll dive in, like I said, that's not very different from historical growth, but we will dive into that growth a little bit more over the next few slides. However, note up here, as Trustee McLeod's eagle eyes already spotted, here we have a big drop in property taxes, 4% drop in property taxes for the next fiscal year. Now you might ask yourself, how can we drop our property taxes by 4% if our expenses are growing 8%? I was going to say, don't worry, all the mysteries will be revealed, but Trustee McLeod already made me reveal it. So the answer is beginning fund balance. So I always like to start after I've kind of shown you all those numbers and have shell-shocked everyone into thinking about those big numbers. But I normally like to tell, although Chair Carter, you're used to the state budget, which is much bigger than that. So you're probably not shell-shocked. But I like to start by telling the board to kind of revisit the things that we talked about at last year's budget presentation and talk about how those worked out. And of course, I could tell 3 of you anything because you have no idea what I said last year. But I try to be uncompromisingly honest, at least about work-related things. Don't ask me how often I exercise. I might not tell the truth. But let's go back and talk about what I was worried about last year and how those things worked out. And last year, I was worried about all kinds of things, as we all were. But they really boiled down to 3 things, at least in the short term. Runaway costs last fiscal year in 21. A related drop in fund balance. And then I was worried about whether property taxes, which are, again, of course, our main revenue source, if they were going to be resilient through the pandemic. And I'm happy to report that we had a really very happy ending on all 3 of those items. So exactly 1 year ago, we were in the middle of a record-breaking retirement year. January had the second most retirements of the fiscal year. In fact, the second most it was a record-breaking month and a record-breaking year. So when we met about the budget last year, our pension coordinator was retiring, 5 or 6 people a day. It was just crazy. We were also in the midst of the craziest spike in new disability claims that we've ever experienced, driven by last year's winter COVID surge. And although fire and police overtime, on which we pay PERS contributions for FPDR 3 members, had kind of cooled off by then, I was living in constant fear of its return at any moment. But in reality, what happened after we adopted the budget last year is that both the COVID claims and the retirements dropped off almost entirely. And we did think that would happen. We weren't positive at that moment last year. But, stay tuned, because right now, as we speak, and I'm sure Kim can talk more about this, and I think Kim and Sam are going to talk more about this in a moment, we are currently experiencing, and have been for the last few weeks, a second massive wave of COVID-related claims right now. We are hoping, or I'm hoping, that those will be of shorter duration, because some of them are for vaccine side effects rather than for COVID infections themselves. Nearly all of our sworn employees are vaccinated. The quarantine period is now shorter for folks who have been infected. So I'm hoping that this is going to be less impactful than last year's COVID wave, but we are right in the middle of another COVID wave. And we'll talk about that even more when I talk about disability benefits. Although Kim, jump in if you want to clarify anything or tell me to stop hoping that these will be of shorter duration. That's what I'm hoping on those COVID claims. For property taxes, we were really worried about delinquencies and compression losses for property taxes, and you would get more compression losses if a lot of governments raised their levies to deal with higher delinquencies. We were all afraid that fewer people would be able to pay their property taxes, and then everyone increasing their levies to manage for that, produces more compression. And compression is the Measure 5 and Measure 50. I hope everyone is familiar with that. If you pay Oregon taxes, you are, but that makes it, you can't charge more than $10 per $1,000 of assessed value for all government levies combined on a piece of property. So properties get forced into compression when they get pushed over that limit, and then everybody loses a little bit from their levy to fit under that cap. So delinquencies have been higher, both last year and this year. They are actually looking like they're going to be worse this year, which was the city economist always predicted that delinquencies would be worse this year because he thought commercial delinquencies would be higher this year. And that we're still living through this year, but it does look like he was right about that. Delinquencies went from, they're kind of normal 4 to 4.5%, just up to 4.6% last year. They're looking like they're going to be more around 5% this year. But that increase in delinquencies was very absorbable. It wasn't as bad as we feared. We were planning for 6%, maybe worse than that. So yes, delinquencies went up, but not in a way that really destroyed the budget. And compression didn't really budge. So we came out great on that. And then in terms of fund balance, at this time last year, we were also projecting a historically low fund balance. We thought we would end last fiscal year with only $8 million because of all of this spending. And 8 million would not be the lowest that it's ever been, but we haven't been in the single digits on fund balance in many, many years, never in my time. And that's getting a little too, I'd be happy to have $8 million in my personal bank account, but that's not enough money in our big operating fund. But as I said, last year's bleeding stopped shortly after our budget meeting, and we wound up only having to draw about $3.5 million out of fund contingency last year to cover all of the spending. And then on top of that, property taxes came in better than we thought, a couple $1 million over budget, with the fortuitous result that we wound up with a perfectly reasonable $14.5 million ending fund balance. And then on top of that, we set fund contingency a little bit high for the current fiscal year to manage for all of those risks that I've just kind of gone over. And at least right now, knock on wood, it appears that we won't need any of that contingency in the current year. Or if we do need some, it won't be much. So that contingency will also fall to fund balance, is what we're projecting right now. So all of that means that we will end the current fiscal year, we project, with about 25.3 million in fund balance. So we are kind of experiencing the upside effects, I guess, of budgeting and forecasting pretty conservatively through the pandemic. Number one, we've been financially stable through the pandemic, at least thus far. And number two, we can now use that excess fund balance to ask the taxpayers for a little bit less next year, as long as as long as, well, we'll talk about risk to the forecast here in a little bit, but that is what I recommend that we do for next year. So that's how things that we were worried about last year shook out. What are some new things to worry about this year? You know, this is what budget people, finance people do all the time. We just worry about things. But naturally, there are new things to worry about this year. Most of these are more kind of FYIs than they are major budget concerns, which is a really nice change of pace from last year. These concerns are just all around less dramatic than the concerns that we had last year. So this first thing is just something to mention, this fire and police consolidation. I just want the board to be aware of this. Council has created an Office of Community Safety at the Office of Management and Finance at the city. And so some of the finance and kind of other backhouse administrative staff at police and fire and also at the emergency management department and the 911 center are being consolidated in that office. Some are not, some are. You know, they're trying to create efficiencies where there are shared functions or like tasks across those bureaus. But of course, it is it's a transition when you do something like that. And that transition has been compounded by staff departures, particularly at fire. So we are experiencing like some lags in our transactions with fire and police that hamper our projections a little bit more than usual. Since year-to-date transactions are something we like to look at when we're putting a budget together. And we didn't get to spend quite as much time as usual combing through budget projections with police and fire staff as we usually do. So those are things that could lower the quality of the work that we do collaboratively with police and fire during this transition period. But I don't think it's a major impact for us. Just thought it was worth mentioning. It is a very big change for the fire and police bureaus in how they put together their budgets and their finance, and a little bit impactful for us. I wanted to mention the retire rehire programs. We are seeing the return of retire rehire at police, and we are seeing some discussions of creating a retire rehire program at fire. So let me explain what that is. This is when an FPDR 2 member, an FPDR 2s again are folks who are hired, sworn members who are either already working in 1991 or were hired between then and 2006, the end of 2006. So those folks, this is a program where they can retire. We start paying them as a retiree, and then their bureau hires them back immediately. And so they continue working as a police officer or firefighter while they're getting a pension from us. It matters to us because it does impact our costs in two ways. In the short run, it drives up pension costs because it incentivizes retirement. But on the other hand, it also drives down PERS contribution costs for FPDR 3 members because we do not pay the PERS contributions on a retire rehire. If the city chooses to enroll that retire rehire in PERS as part of the arrangement they come to when they rehire them, then the city has to pay for those PERS contributions. We don't pay for them. So it increases our pension costs, although at the same time, we're incentivizing retirement. At the same time, they're getting a lower pension than they would have if they had continued working. And we're paying them, starting to pay them sooner. So, in the long run, I'm not sure that it has much of an impact on our costs, but in the short run, it can.
Can I ask a couple questions about this,
yes.
Stacey? This is the first time I've really gotten familiar with this. First, how does that 50 compare to the earlier periods, like 2018, 2019? Is it consistent with that or higher or lower?
That is a really good question that I don't know. I cannot remember the answer to. Okay. I'd have to go back and look. I mean, I probably better not speculate.
And it's not particularly important. I was just curious if there was a kind of a wave of kind of built up, desire to get back in after the postponement of that program for a couple of years.
Well, I wish Trustee Culp was here to address that because I have heard that anecdotally. But I don't know if there's any truth to that.
Okay, not an important thing. But then going on to if they are rehired, they're a rehired retiree. Does it change, other than the fact that they're getting a lower pension and they're starting it sooner? Other than those things, when they are rehired, are they accruing any future pension benefits? Will it change their salary average? Will it change their years of service? Anything like that?
Nope, it doesn't change anything related to the FPDR pension. So we just treat them as if, we don't care if they're working or they're at home watching TV or they, went to work on an oil rig in Alaska, we're just paying them in that same way. So it has no impact on their FPDR pension.
Got it.
Good question.
Thanks for explaining.
And as a side note, it has no impact on the disability plan. They're not covered by the FPDR disability plan. They're covered by workers' compensation. So they're totally out of the FPDR system once they retire, except for the retirement benefit. So just clarification on that.
Thank you.
Yes, good point, Sam. Thank you for chiming in on that. For police and fire, it's considerably more expensive to hire a rehire than to hire a new person. So they don't do it for financial reasons. They do it for staffing shortage reason. That's why it was suspended at police 2 years ago. It's just, it's a lot more expensive for them. So not only do they have to pay more money because these folks are top step and have premiums and longevity pay and all of that, but they have to come up with the money for the PERS contributions themselves if they're going to let them be on PERS. So it's a lot more expensive for them. So they do it to manage staffing shortages, not for financial reasons. We also have an open Portland Police Association contract. It's not news to Trustee McLeod that pretty much one of our sworn labor contracts is always open. There are 3 sworn labor contracts. There is the Portland Police Association, which covers police officers, sergeants, detectives, and criminalists. That's the biggest union for our members. Following that is the Portland Firefighters Association, which covers everyone, every sworn employee at fire up through battalion chief. And then there's the Portland Police Commanding Officers Association, which covers police lieutenants. And then there's, fewer than 100 sworn employees at police and fire between the two of them who are non-represented, who are not in the union. And that's captain and above at police and deputy chief and above at fire. So these contracts are, always expiring and getting renegotiated. The PPA contract, however, it's more than 6 months past expiration right now, which means that potential retroactive payments are piling up. Although it won't be too bad if it is just for a 1.6% COLA. Most other city employees got a 1.6% COLA last July 1 of 2021. So we are expecting that when their contract is finalized, it will include a retroactive COLA for them. But this is we're always nervous when we have an open contract and we have to finalize a budget because we assume that the status quo continues, and of course that doesn't always happen in a labor contract. So we will have some risk related to that. And final, oh yes, Chair Carter.
Thanks, Stacey. Just for my own clarification, under the retire rehires, once a person has retired, do you have to reset that if more money is added to their retirement plan as a result of the rehiring?
Nope. So we don't, when they are rehired, it doesn't impact their FPDR pension at all. We essentially have said to us, you are retired. And this has all been negotiated as part of the retire rehire programs. Well, I shouldn't say negotiated because the FPDR plan doesn't allow for anything else. But so when they retire, they're done. Their final pay has been calculated, their service credit. There's no way for them to get more service credit in the FPDR plan. There's no way for them to increase their final pay. Now, depending on the terms of which they've been rehired by the city, they could start accumulating a PERS pension if the city decides to make them into a PERS covered position, as they would with other new hires, but we don't pay their PERS contributions. The city's on the hook for that.
Okay. Thanks.
Yes, of course. For inflation, I mean, this is kind of the big, or one of the biggest economic stories of the year. And of course, it's impacting everything, including our little pension and disability fund. I'm sure you're all aware of this, that this is, we clocked in at about 7% inflation for 2021, and that is the most inflation we've seen in the US in about 30 years. If it weren't so terrible, it'd be kind of exciting because this is really just kind of, unprecedented in the last, generation or so. The primary way it impacts our fund is through wage inflation. And that is because wage cost of living adjustments for city employees are tied very closely to inflation. So most of the city labor contracts connect wage COLAs perfectly, exactly one-to-one to inflation, except that there is a cap of 5% on wage COLAs and a floor of 1%. So in this case, city employees are actually going to have a wage COLA next year that's less than inflation because of that 5% cap. There are years when they have received 1% when we actually had no inflation, or I can't think of a time when there was a period of deflation, but in any event, so that's the primary way that high inflation impacts us. We are a little protected by those caps in the labor contracts. That kind of the worst thing it can do is go to a 5% wage COLA, but we will see a 5% wage COLA for all of our sworn employees next year. And that in turn will increase the cost of virtually all FPDR benefits, because most of them are connected to wages in one way or another. But inflation is also hitting us in administrative costs a little bit. Although again, that's mostly in personnel, because everybody who works for FPDR is also a city employee and is also going to see that 5% wage COLA on July 1st of 2022. All right, so that is kind of what is new and exciting this year.
Hey,
So
Stacey,
now, yes.
Sorry, you may have answered this question in the previous slide, so my apologies for asking again. How do you figure in any potential impact to the budget if we were hit by another variant?
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about, additional COVID waves and why we have not set aside additional funds for COVID. Well, it's not entirely true that we haven't. If I were to skip ahead to the contingency slide, we have put enough money into fund contingency for next year to cover the same level of increased disability costs that we experienced last year when we had our COVID wave. So we shot up about $1.5 million on our disability costs last year. And so we put enough money in fund contingency for that to happen again next year. And we have more than enough in fund contingency to cover, things like that in the current fiscal year. And then, overtime, which is the other, the COVID impacts for us have really fallen into two places. One is disability claims from sworn employees either becoming infected or exposed and having to quarantine. And then the other way is through overtime, which increases at police and fire when they have a lot of folks who are out, and then they have to bring more folks in on overtime to cover those shifts. And we pay first contributions on that overtime. So we have built some money into the budget for those things to recur this year and next year. But I will tell you that I'm also banking on them not being as bad as they have been in the past. And if the board is uncomfortable with that and wants to throw some more money into fund contingency for those events, then we should talk about that at the end of the presentation and see if the board wants to see a little more money put into fund contingency to mitigate for that risk. But I should also say that disability benefits are a very small part of our, when you're talking about $1.5 million on a $200+ million operation every year, like the impacts, no matter how bad, as bad as they were last year, the worst thing we had to do was take $3.5 million out of our fund contingency in our $200 million fund. So unless something really, really new and dramatic happens, the risks are pretty manageable within the size of our fund and for the kind of contingency that we normally set. To be honest, I'm always far more worried about property tax revenues where, that's a big number. We're trying to raise $200 million in property taxes. And if we miss on our delinquency assumptions or our compression assumptions, that could have a much bigger impact, I think. But I think, Trustee Wong, I'm going to say more about that as we go along as well. So please let me know if I haven't talked enough about it by the end.
Thank you.
Right, so I'm going to turn. Oh, go ahead.
I was just asking if the board members had any other questions before you move on. Okay, thanks.
Okay. I'll take a minute to take a drink of water. So I want to talk. Everyone will get tired of my voice by the end, I promise. So now I want to talk through our expenses, so we can talk about expenses in a little more detail. And then I'll talk about revenues in a little more detail. And then I'll talk about risks to the forecast, including the risk of additional COVID waves, new variants, et cetera. So we kind of have some of that big picture stuff. You at least know the big picture issues that we need to be thinking about as we move through this. But so now we're going to talk through the details of expenses. And I always start with expenses, which is a bit backwards if you're used to conventional budgeting. because usually you talk about how much you have and then you talk about how you're going to spend it. But at FPDR, we talk about how much we need to spend first, since most of our expenses are non-discretionary. And then we talk about how we're going to raise the revenue to meet that need. So the pie chart in front of you shows all of our expenses. This pie gets a little bit larger every year because our expenses grow every year, particularly while we're going through this generation of transitioning in the pre-funded pension. But the division of the pie is also changing, just very, very slowly. You will see that virtually all of our expenses are pension related in one way or another. Almost 3/4 of our costs are for our direct pension benefits for our FPDR 1 and 2 members who are on the FPDR plan for pension. And then, about half of the remainder is for PERS contributions, which are the contributions we're making for the folks who were hired 2007 and later for their PERS pension, which is because they're covered in PERS. So most of our expenses are related to pensions. PERS contributions are a little bit more of our budget this year. Last year, they were 14%. This year, they're 16%. That's what we should expect to see as we phase in the pre-funded PERS population. Our fund expenses are a little bit less. And again, fund management expenses, again, I know that's kind of non-intuitive to folks. Our contingency and general fund overhead and fund transfers and things like that. They're a little bit less of our budget this year as compared with last year. And that's because I'm planning to lower fund contingency a little bit, or I'd like to do that. And then disability benefits and administrative expenses are unchanged from last year. They were 4% and 2% of our budget last year. They're 4% and 2% of our budget this year. So let's talk about pension payments, because as you saw on the previous slide, this is about 70% of our budget right here. So this is the single most consequential thing for us to get right when we're talking about budget. Fortunately, it's not very impacted by COVID risk, other than that it could incentivize retirement. Folks want to get out of the business of being in public safety during a pandemic. Perhaps it incentivizes retirements, but fortunately, it's not seriously impacted by COVID waves. So we build this budget with a combination of actuarial models and economic forecasts. And if you look at the average, and I won't go into all the detail of how we do that, but I'm happy to go into detail on that with anyone who wants to know more about it. You can see that the average, that we're projecting about 5.5% growth in this item for next year. And we experienced about 3.8% growth in pension expenses for the current year. And our average annual growth over the last 5 years in pensions has been about 5%. So that 5.4% is pretty typical. The 3.8% for the current year was lower than I thought it would be because of the huge number of retirements we had in the prior fiscal year. But we had a smaller than usual cost of living adjustment with the 1.6%. And we also had an unusual number of deaths last year. So I think those two things held that number down just a bit. So as we look forward with this budget, we count up how many people we think will pass away. We count up how many people we think will retire. We figure out how much we think on average new pensions will be. There are a whole bunch of pieces that go into this. The piece that I'm always, over the long run, most of those pieces kind of come out pretty close to what we're projecting on average because we have a large enough pool of people that we're projecting it for. But I always get nervous about retirements because those are very much impacted year to year by different events. So our actuarial modeling shows that yields just 38 service retirements in the current fiscal year. And we've had 24 so far, so it seems pretty on target. And it yields only 44 retirements next year is what kicks out of our actuarial models. So 44 retirements, that's fewer retirements than we've had in 8 of the last 10 years. And the issue there is just that the number of people eligible to retire is so much smaller after all of the retirements that we had over the last 18 months. And those who are left have less service time and they're younger, which makes our actuarial models predict that they're less likely to retire. But these are unprecedented times and actuarial models are by their nature backward looking. So we went ahead and added 20 cushion retirements to our projection for this year, just to make sure that if we get surprised and 20 more people retire than we think, we've got money built into this particular budget, totally separate from fund contingency, to cover that if we need to. And in the back of my mind, I was also concerned that that retire rehire program coming back might incentivize some retirements in the short run. But on the other hand, we have a big COLA coming up on July 1st, 2022, that 5%, which will incentivize waiting another year to retire so that you can get a whole year of that big COLA in your final pay calculation. There's also the risk that deaths will remain high because of the continued pandemic, which would reduce costs. So, there's a lot of push-pull on the retirement side, whether we don't know if we think we're really going to get more than we would actuarially predict or not, but those are some of the factors we were thinking about as we built the budget, and we decided to throw sort of 20 extra in there just to be on the safe side. But if you set aside the kind of the particularities of this year and last year, the main story here is that costs are going to keep going up as our FPDR2 retirees continue to become a bigger proportion of this group, because the pension benefit for FPDR2 retirees is much more generous than the pension benefit for FPDR1 retirees, who are now passing away and becoming a smaller part of this group. And the FPDR2s are continuing to retire and become a bigger part of this group. So that's kind of the big backstory of what's going on with pension benefits over time. I always like to show the board, you guys see this in various ways kind of throughout the year. But speaking of FPDR2 retirements, let's talk about FPDR2 retirements over the last couple of years for just a minute. And you all saw at least some version of this data in November at the State of FPDR presentation. Oh, not all of you, because Trustee McClary wasn't here. Although this graph has some more detail. So this is 10 years of actual retirements, and then our projected retirements for the current year, and then projected retirements for the next 5 fiscal years. Fire's in red and blue is, and police is in blue because we're stereotypical like that. And then the total, if you want to look at it just in total, look at this purple bar, and you can see it kind of cruising along there. And then I've got the actual numbers for you down here in this table. I mean, it's kind of fun that both our most retirements ever and our least retirements ever actually both happened during this time frame. So fiscal year in 20, we only had 19 retirements. It was our lowest year ever. And then it was immediately followed by our highest fiscal year ever, fiscal year in 21, which just ended on June 30, where we had 106 retirements. So, I mean, that's the whole spectrum right there in FPDR's history. So you can see why overall the actuarial models are great at predicting who's going to retire overall, but in any one year, boy, it can be very bumpy. And that's why I get nervous budgetarily about making sure we've got enough to cover things that were going to happen. And we do expect retirement, although we don't expect it to go down to really low levels. We're not expecting 19 retirements next year. And then it kind of goes back up to more typical levels in the out years of the forecast. All right. Are there any questions about the pension, the FPDR 1 and 2 pension benefit budget before I move on to PERS contributions?
It's just an interesting point, Stacy. I see where you find police retiring more often than you do firefighters. Is that because of the endangerment of the job itself, you find?
We certainly find that police retire with fewer years of service than fire folks.
I'd add to that also, there's a bigger group.
Okay.
More of them.
Oh, yes. No, that's true. Like when you're looking at sheer numbers here and you're looking at the blues being so much higher than the reds, right. That's right. Fire is only about 2/3 the size of police. So okay. Yeah, there are more people who can retire. I thought you were kind of asking about the pattern of when they retire. It is interesting. Like we always joke in our office that we almost, we have a lot of police officers who retire pretty darn close, to the day they can. Right. They're not hanging around. And then we joke that we can't pry the fire guys out of there with a crowbar. Like we once retired a firefighter with 50 years of service. I know I've told the board that 100 times, but it's so exciting.
Wow.
It's really crazy. So we have 30-year, we have a lot of fire who work for the full 30 years and even significantly beyond. We don't have many police who work for the full 30 years. So, but what goes into that, also you should bear in mind that police officers tend to be a little older when they get hired than firefighters. So, they're a little older. The jobs are different though, obviously, as well. I'm sure Trustee McClary could comment. Well, you haven't been a police officer, so I don't know if you could compare the two, but.
That's right.
Although there are a couple of firefighters who are also police officers, right? Those arson investigators.
There's a couple, 2 or 3.
Interesting. Hey, Stacey, just a quick question about a number. So for fiscal year in 22 and 23, where you're showing 59 and 50 total, are those the numbers without that extra 20 added in there? For budget?
I can't remember. Let me go back and look.
Okay, otherwise I was thinking next year, if that was without that other 20 in there, that'd only be 30, and which really would surprise me. So.
Yes, so let me go back and double check. I don't think that it includes our 20 cushion, but let me circle back to that question at the end when I can go pull up my file. See, soon you guys will all be experienced enough to repeatedly stump me like Trustee McLeod has today. That's good though. Good question. So let me circle back to that. All right, anything else before we move on to PERS contributions? I would stop and look that up right now, but then I have to pull up the file.
No, in fact, today is not even important, just curious.
Okay, yes. So PERS contribution. So this is the second biggest item in our budget. It's about 16%, if you think back to the pie chart. And it is the fastest growing part of our budget, though. So what drives this budget is the number of FPDR3 members, who are folks who were sworn in 2007 or later, how much they get paid, and PERS contribution rates. I mean, those are the 3 things that go into this budget. So the first 2 go up every year. Every year there are more and more FPDR3 members because every single, except for a rehire, everybody they hire is a new FPDR3 members. And virtually none of the FPDR3 members have worked long enough. None of them have worked long enough to retire. Some of them are still retiring because they have pre-existing PERS service. But so we're just building that population more and more every year. And of course, their pay goes up every year because there are wage COLAs every year. But more importantly than that, this is an immature population from a financial, from a career point of view. I'm sure they're not any more immature than the rest of us, but they are immature in that they're early career. So many of them are not even at top step police officer or firefighter yet. They haven't moved into longevity pay. Most of them are just now starting to get promoted, starting to get specialty pay assignments. So their pay is going up significantly more than just by wage COLAs every year. You're seeing that typical early career pattern where their pay might be growing 10% a year. And then PERS contribution rates go up every 2 years because PERS is, as we all know, trying to deal with an unfunded liability. And so every 2 years when they can, because they adjust their rates every 2 years, they raise their rates. So that does create kind of some bumpiness in the growth pattern there, that you see bigger bumps in years when PERS contribution rates go up. So growth for the current year and next year's budget is not out of line with the usual growth for PERS contributions. I know that 20% growth and 18% growth sounds like a lot, but again, this budget is growing exponentially as the underlying population grows and matures, as it grows, and then as they mature in terms of salary. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I really want to say about PERS contributions. I don't think so, unless folks have any other questions.
Real quick, the third to last bullet there, remarkable considering no PERS rate increase for fiscal year 23. So the employer rate is for the employee PERS employer rate is not going up at all in 23.
Nope, it went up for the current fiscal year in 22, and so now it won't go up again until fiscal year in 24 because they raise those rates every other.
Got it. Yep. Thank you.
Yep. Every other year.
Got it.
Yeah. So I did. That's why I was like, do we want to talk about this? But just saying that rate, it's not out of line with what we've seen in the past, but it is a bit high considering there was no PERS rate increase for this year. So that's why I talk about some of the factors that were making that making it grow a little bit more than you might expect, considering that there was no PERS contribution increase for next year, or rate increase. All right, let's talk a little bit about disability benefits. Remember again that this is about 4% of our total budget. You have seen this slide or something like it also in November at the state of FPDR. It's been updated. It's kind of a pretty slide, kind of like Neapolitan ice cream. Only if, I guess, if Neapolitan ice cream had gray in it and green. But let me kind of talk the board through what's going on here. This is actual spending in 2021. This is the projected spending for this current year. The recommended budget for next year, and then the forecast for the following 4 years. And then these are all the different flavors, since I'm sticking with the ice cream metaphor here, of disability benefits that you will, that we pay and that you're gonna see. So you can see that we've kind of forecast a steady as she goes. And Trustee Wong, I'm coming back around to your COVID question here. You can see that we've kind of forecast a steady as she goes kind of budget for almost all of these categories. You see that, you know, really we're just seeing increases that are in line with wage inflation here, because except for medical payments, these other benefits are all a percentage of wages. So they're going to go up as wages go up. And medical inflation is going to go up with medical inflation, which is what we've used to increase medical inflation going forward. But you'll see that there's one kind of discordant note on this slide. And that is in short-term disability benefits. And so this is where you can see that our disability benefits were very high last year in fiscal year in 21, and that was because of COVID claims in the sworn workforce. And you can see that we projected they'd kind of go down to normal levels in fiscal year in 2022, and then just kind of grow along. As I just shared, we are in the middle of yet another, you know, crazy wave of COVID disability claims. So I actually think if I had wrapped this slide up, you know, a couple of days ago, I might have nudged this square up a little bit. The question is, do we think that this is going to continue into the future? We can easily cover any additional costs here with fund contingency. We can easily cover additional costs in the future with contingency, because again, we're talking about a couple $1 million, which is not a significant expense in the context of our fund. But I did want to call out that, you know, we have been assuming that we are past the worst financial impacts of the COVID pandemic. And we've been assuming that, you know, that as we have additional variants or additional waves, that they will become increasingly less problematic with our mostly vaccinated, you know, workforce, as the community figures out how to make these, you know, less disruptive. You see the CDC already shortening the quarantine period, so folks don't have to be away from work for quite as long. And hopefully, as we don't see our sworn employees away from work for as long as they were in the first wave, because they're vaccinated, quarantine periods are longer, infections are hopefully less severe. So it is not that this forecast assumes COVID goes away, but it does assume that the financial impacts of COVID are greatly reduced to the point where we're sort of returning more to normal from a financial point of view. But that is why you see us projecting that we're going to come down off of this high with these short-term disability benefits. And I'm a lot less confident in that than I was even 2 weeks ago. So I want to be transparent about that. Any question, but I'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about fund contingency too, about how we would manage for additional COVID related costs. Are there any other questions?
Okay, police and fire, and you don't know the extent to which the disease itself, the pandemic, might affect them for those that are long haulers. And so how can we anticipate that? Or is that considered an emergency kind of fiscal issue?
Well, I'm actually going to ask Kim to address the issue of long haul. But before I turn it over to Kim and let her answer that a little bit, if she can, we do always, again, though this is based on actuarial modeling, we do assume that some folks move from short-term disability, in this orange line, to long-term disability, which is part of this blue line. But we have not increased and we do that again based on actuarial modeling of how many people will become long-term disabled. We have not updated that model in COVID times. But again, even if we had 10 or 15, that would be really crazy, unprecedented to have 10 or 15 people moving from short-term to long-term disability.
Right.
Since this is only 4% of our budget, in the context of our budget, the entire disability spending could triple, quadruple, quintuple, and it wouldn't be a problem because it's such a small portion of our budget. If that happened on the pension side, boy, would we be in trouble, right? But on the disability, side, this budget is so small that all kinds of crazy things could happen with it, and it would just be a little portion of fund contingency. So that's why I don't want the board to get too worried about risk in the disability budget. But I also, from a programmatic point of view, as we're operating the Bureau and thinking about how we're going to manage for these things, I think there's also that to consider. So I wonder if Kim had anything she wanted to say about long haul kind of COVID claims and cases, if we've had any to date.
Yeah, thank you, Stacy. And we look at them as they come in, as the claims are filed, and as we administer them to see if their conditions are going to be short in duration, which most of them have been, or if we're going to have long hauler. And I'm really pleased to report that we've only had two claims that were long hauler claims. Both of the members have recovered well. They're back to work. Fortunately, what we've seen with this current spike in claims is that the duration of disability has been shortened. Part of that, the medical providers are following CDC new guidelines, which shorten the length of disability. But to answer the long hauler question directly, we've been really fortunate. We just have not had the numbers that even some other jurisdictions have had with folks suffering from the long-term extent of COVID. Most of our folks have had it. They've had their couple weeks off of work and they've returned to regular work, which is really good.
Thanks.
I don't know if this is a question for Kim or somebody else, but do you guys know whether the city of Portland follows the CDC definition of fully vaccinated?
It is, that's a good question. I would say I think they do.
Yeah, fully vaccinated right now is the 2 doses.
Okay.
Everybody, including the government, is recommending the booster, but so far nobody's required the booster or made that part of the vaccine requirement. So the city's still getting your double doses or single if you have the Johnson & Johnson version, but you've got your full vaccinations. Strongly recommending the booster, but it's not required in the city.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, because I was trying to figure out the potential impact of 2 doses without the booster in the new variants that may be coming down the pike, and how that may change your risk analysis. But if we follow CDC guidance at this point, it's sort of a moot point.
I think it's a really good question. And can I ask, just for a refresher, generally speaking, what are the fully vaccinated statuses, rough percent for police and fire? Because I know testing was an alternative, but do you have just a general approximation of what those fully vaccinated statuses are? Percents?
I don't. That's something we'd have to follow up on.
Okay. My only reason for bringing it up is I guess, Stacey, I think your comments about, there is a risk in this and here. And I think the comment about long COVID is really, at the times we're having big waves like Delta and Omicron, all the focus goes towards that, the impact on hospitalizations and deaths imminently. But ultimately, things will circle back to, the long-term effects of things, and certainly long COVID, and just in general, the implications on, our human system and what that's going to mean. But that's been kind of pushed to the background right now. I think that'll have an impact. But your comment is well made that, even if it's a substantial impact, even if it were a 10% impact, its relative amount of the budget is so small. And at this point, we don't really have much information to do it. But as we circle back to talking about the contingency, I just wanted to kind of have that in mind. And I think knowledge about what the current full vaccination percents are, even though it's maybe a moving target in the future, would be helpful in understanding what the what the size of the potential risk might be for long COVID or related issues in the future.
No, I appreciate both of those comments, Trustee Wong, about, if the city is not requiring a booster shot, then how protected is our sworn workforce as we move through these other variants? And then also, as Trustee McLeod said, well, how vaccinated is that workforce? What are the percent? So if Kim can get her hands on that data and get back to you. I know it is higher at police than it is at fire, but that is all that I have heard or seen in a long time. And the data I saw was probably 3 months old. So I don't even know. So hopefully Kim can follow up on that. I think those are good points.
We'll follow up on
I think those
that.
are good points as we think about risk. Yeah.
Yeah, and I will that I have really old information, so I don't want to guess on that.
Yeah, no. And I'm sure it is, hopefully it's increasing every day. But the city did have a vaccination requirement, but there was an exception process. So I think that's what Trustee McLeod is driving at there. So good things to think about as we try to think about the ongoing financial risk profile of the pandemic, which is, lots of folks are, thinking about, the health risk profile, but I'm busy thinking about the financial risks associated here. But as I said, keeping in mind that most of the impacts for COVID are going to land in disability for us, and disability is a very small part of our budget. So I don't feel very exposed around that COVID stuff, but I do think it still merits discussion. Moving on to talking about the cost of administering the plan. So this is administrative expenses. So this is about 2% of our budget. And you can see that personnel is about 2/3 of all of our administrative costs, which is similar to prior years. We have 17 employees at FPDR, and that is unchanged for many years now. And although we can control the number and types of positions at the Bureau, compensation, the board and Sam can control that, but the compensation is mostly controlled by the city, and it's set in accordance with the city's compensation rules and their compensation plans. So we are seeing bigger growth in personnel than we have in many years. Again, I keep talking about that 5% wage COLA, but again, it's because of that 5% wage COLA that we expect all city staff to get on July 1st, 2022. Although I think it's interesting to note that 14 of our 17 employees didn't get any wage COLA in 2020. So when I was looking, I always like to look back and see how my projections have changed over time. And the 2023 budget is actually only $2,000 different from our 2023 forecast from 2 years ago for personnel. And that's, so we skipped a COLA one year, got a bigger COLA another year, and it kind of all came out in the wash in that sense, which is kind of crazy that it worked out that way. Elsewhere in the budget, we are seeing a little bit of impact of inflation in services and supplies, both those purchased from other city bureaus and those purchased from external vendors. Although we're not seeing that everywhere. The biggest cost increases we're seeing are in labor-intensive services, which are experiencing the same salary pressures that we are as inflation goes up. So for example, what we pay the city attorney's office or technology services, those are going up more than other parts of our administrative budget. And we're protected by having contracts in place right now with some of our service providers, but that's like with Milliman, we're not experiencing cost increases with them because we have contracts with them and they can't raise their prices. But that's a short-term thing. In the long run, the next time we are setting up contracts, we will probably be paying more for those as well. But there are also some cost savings on the horizon in administration, and Sam is going to talk about those after I'm done with the budget today, because we are going to move into a smaller and cheaper office later this spring, and we're hoping that that's going to produce about $50,000 a year in savings. So that's going to offset most of our increases in services and supplies. So that's great. So Sam will talk more about that in a bit. Last slide on sort of the expenditure side. I always like to talk a little bit about what's going on at that fund level, outside of operating expenses, but we've actually been talking about that quite a bit today because we've been talking about fund balance a lot. So I thought I would show you a slide that's just about fund balance. So this slide shows you actual fund balance for the last 3 fiscal years, and then our projected fund balance for the next 2 fiscal years. So it shows beginning and ending fund balance, beginning in blue and ending in orange. And as we were just talking about with Trustee Clowry, right? I think he was the one who brought it up, that the beginning fund balance is the amount of money we have in our fund on July 1st, and ending fund balance is the amount of cash we have in our fund on June 30. I mean, that is what it is. So notice the mirroring, which actually makes this chart, I think, kind of pretty. It's got kind of a nice shape to it, because logically, you know, your ending fund balance on June 30 of the prior fiscal year will be your beginning fund balance on July 1st of the next fiscal year. So that's why you get this kind of nice shape where it's always mirroring each other. You know, ending fund balance for fiscal year in 20 is here, so beginning fund balance for the next fiscal year will be exactly the same. So why do we have fund balance? It's probably obvious, but we have fund balance so we don't overdraw our fund and go negative. So some of our fund balance is dedicated to what I think of as daily cash flow management. So you can think of this as the cushion that you keep in your checking account to make sure that you never overdraw your checking account. But you know, we just need a lot more cushion in our fund. So last year, in fiscal year end June 30, fiscal year in 2021, our average daily cash balance was 55 million. But there was a ton of volatility within that. At our lowest point, we had less than $1 million on November 13th. And at our highest point, we had 137.6 million on December 11th. So there's lots of variability. So we need to have some cash on hand to manage that variability. We manage the big cash flow shortage with tax anticipation notes, but then throughout the rest of the year, there's still a lot of variability in cash. And then some of our fund balance is dedicated to contingency, which you can think of like your personal emergency fund that you have maybe in a savings account. We just keep it in our same fund. So we use that if we need to spend more than we planned or budgeted, or if revenues fall short of what we expected, then we dip into that contingency. And of course, that makes our fund balance go down. And then fund balance is where extra savings or extra revenues go to live. So if we spend less than we planned or budgeted, or revenues come in higher than we thought, then we build up our fund balance. So that's, you know, what the purpose of fund balance is. It is a cost of living outside the general fund. If you're a bureau that is living inside the general fund, then the general fund takes care of all of this for you. We have to take care of it for ourselves. So you can see if you look at the chart that our beginning fund balance was, let's see, 11.8 million in fiscal year in 19, and then it was 19.6 million in fiscal year in 20. And this is the reason I didn't put more years on this chart, is because this is actually a pretty good snapshot of historic variability. We're usually bouncing around in the teens. It has been creeping up because we need to have a little more cash on hand as our fund gets bigger. But we're generally bouncing around in the teens. But fiscal year in 2021, you know, wasn't as bad as we were concerned it could be. As we talked about before, we only had to draw 3.5 million out of fund contingency, and property taxes came in about 2 million over budget, as I mentioned. So with all of those things, then our fund balance, which I was worried was going to, you know, go way down, our fiscal year in 2021 fund balance, we wound up at almost $15 million. So that's, you know, pretty much on target with where we would want to be. But, you know, because we were mitigating for all of these pandemic risks and making sure we had plenty in contingency to cover all of the risks that we were facing last year around retirements and COVID and property taxes, we set our contingency pretty high for the current fiscal year. So now that it appears that we probably won't need much of any of that contingency, and that it will therefore drop to fund balance, we think now that we're going to wind up with this big ending fund balance, a little over 25 million at the end of this fiscal year on June 30, 2022. And then you can see that I have a plan. I would like to draw that back down to kind of the $15 million range by the end of next fiscal year. And the way we're going to accomplish that is by not increasing the property tax levy, or at least that's what I recommend. So that's a little bit more on the question of fund balance. Any questions on that, or any questions about expenses before I move on to revenues and then forecast risks? I'm not going to go over this slide, but I'll just point out that it's in your presentation, because I think it always bears repeating. And I say this every year, but Budgets and financial forecasts are really just collections of assumptions applied to numbers. So it's really important for us to clearly identify what our assumptions are, so you can see them for yourself and judge for yourself to the extent that you can, if they seem reasonable or not. Obviously, our goal is to make reasonable assumptions, but as in all human endeavors, making good assumptions gets harder when the environment around you is changing quickly. So I just want to be really transparent about giving you maybe more detail than you want about some of the key assumptions. There are more assumptions than this, but these are the key assumptions that go into the expenditure side of the budget. Let me know if you have any questions about that. Moving on to our next topic, which is revenues. This is a much simpler and shorter story because it's kind of a one-man play starring property taxes, because as you can see, nearly all of our money comes from property taxes. And if you consider the beginning fund balance is really just leftover property taxes, really almost all of it comes from property taxes. There's these two tiny slivers of other revenue, which is mostly interest income on fund balance, by the way, and interagency revenues, which are so small that they don't even round up to 1%. I'm sorry, I should have taken that out a decimal place or two so that they didn't show up as 0%. But I can tell you that combined, these make up about 0.4% of our revenues. So even combined, they're less than half of 1% of our revenues. They did used to make up a little bit more of our revenue picture, which I'll talk about on a slide here in just a minute. But before we do that, let's talk about property taxes, because that is where all the action is. So property taxes are essentially a plug in our budget. We figure out how much we need in property taxes by taking all of our expense requirements after we've got done building that budget, taking out beginning fund balance, taking out, and expense requirements includes contingency, I should say, taking out beginning fund balance, and then taking out other revenues. And then that tells us how much we need to raise in property tax revenue every year. So, this year, as I've mentioned several times, we need less tax revenue for fiscal year end 23 because we plan to use our large projected fund balance to cover our usual expense growth that we've been having. So that's why we are reducing property taxes at the same time that our expenses are kind of growing as usual, but we're going to use up some of the excess fund balance that we built up over the last couple of years. So I know that we've already talked about that plenty, but let me talk for a minute about the impact on the tax rates. And so since we have a new board, let me tell you why we care about tax rates and the two different kinds of tax rates. So the RMV rate, that stands for real market value. So that is the rate that is the property tax rate per $1,000 of real market value on a property. And the AV rate is the assessed value rate. So that is property taxes per $1,000 of assessed value. Now, when you pay if you live in the city of Portland and you pay property tax bills, you will see your property taxes are figured on, well, no matter where you live, your property taxes are figured on assessed value, not on real market value. And that's because of the Measure 5 and 50 property tax caps that went into effect in the 1990s. So if you want to think about our impacts to taxpayers, you want to think about the AV rate. Why do we care about the RMV rate then? The RMV rate is kind of fictional, really, right? Because nobody pays anything based on it. But we care about it because the cap on our levy and city charter is based on RMV. So we cannot charge more than $2.80 per $1,000 of real market value. So that's why we pay so much attention to the RMV rate to make sure that we're well under that 280 cap. But we also pay attention to the AV rate because this tells us how much of an impact we're having on actual Portland property taxpayers. So because we are dropping the property tax levy a bit next year, we are also expecting our rates to drop, both for RMV and for AV. And what goes into these assumptions is not just how much money we need. We also have to figure out how much we need to cover delinquencies and compression losses. We also think about how much assessed value growth, how much growth there will be in assessed value and real market value. We get most of those assumptions from the city economist, and I'll throw up a slide that has those assumptions on it as well here in a minute. Last thing, are there any questions about property taxes? think I've worn you all down at this point. By the end, I usually by the end I've beat everyone into submission by just talking and talking. I'll try to speed it up. This slide on other revenue, again, other revenue is less than half of 1% of our budget. I think it's a little bit interesting just for the board to know how much it has declined in recent times. So I think you all know what interest income is. That's our interest on our fund balance. But interagency revenues, this is money that we get from the fire and police bureaus when they contract out their services to third parties. The biggest example of this was the Portland Police Bureau contracting out their services to TriMet for transit police. And when they do that, TriMet pays for, the fully loaded wages of those officers. So not just their wages, but also overhead rates to cover their pension and disability costs and overhead rates to cover lots of different things. But we get the money that is charged for their pension and disability overhead rates. So what has happened with interagency revenues that used to be, well over $1 million and are now kind of bouncing around in the $500,000 to $350,000 range are several things. The biggest thing was the Police Bureau canceled their contract with TriMet to provide transit police at the end of calendar year 2020. And that was where most of this money came from. But also, and the Police Bureau has been short-staffed, and so they've been less willing to loan out their staff for special events and third parties who might need police services. And then a lot of the events that the Police Bureau would provide security for, like the Cinco de Mayo Festival or Trailblazers games, things like that have just been canceled during the pandemic. So we do expect a little bit of a rebound in those revenues, but they're never going to go back to what they once were because we are no longer providing those services to TriMet. And then interest income, this is all about interest rates, which, just sort of fell off a cliff and have been hanging out down here. We do expect interest rates, we expect interest rates to recover a little bit. I know everyone's very excited about the Federal Reserve Board and what they're going to do this week and what they're going to do in March. We'll be tracking interest rates, but for now we've assumed that they're not going to move up very much. But we do expect them to move up. And then as with expenses, I just like to share with the board the major assumptions on the revenue side. These are less interesting, again, because they pertain to smaller portions of our revenues. But up here, you'll see the property tax assumptions, which I always do think are kind of interesting. In fiscal year in 2022, these are actuals. So these are not assumptions. We know all of this. We don't know discounts and delinquencies yet. But the rest of this is actuals because the property tax bills have already gone out, long since gone out. And then you can see what the city economist is projecting going forward, that we are assuming like a kind of a return to our usual RMV growth. We've continue to have really good real market value growth in Portland through all of this. Assessed value growth is interesting, which it almost never is. So I just have to point this out. That out here in fiscal year in 25, you see this big jump in the assessed value and kind of a little baby bump after that in fiscal year in 26. And that is urban renewal areas returning to the regular property tax rules. And so as long as that actually happens as planned, we'll get, it'll be a boon to the general fund. It'll be a boon to every buddy who levies taxes in the city of Portland, to Multnomah County, city of Portland, because you'll have much more property on which to spread out your tax rate. So that should drop our AV tax rate out in these out years in fiscal year in 25 and 26 as those URAs come back online. All right, we're almost there, guys. Almost there. Okay, last section is to talk about risks to the forecast. So I think that we have talked through most of these to some degree as we have moved along. And I know that there are a lot of words on these slides, on these next two slides, but it's to compensate for all the numbers I have on all of the other slides. But just as it's important to be really transparent about the assumptions that go into these forecasts, it's important to be clear about the things that are out there that could make the assumptions we've made significantly wrong. And to also kind of make sure that we've thought through all of the risks that are out there. Nobody's ever going to come up with all of the risks. Lord knows when I did our fiscal year in 20 budget, I did not imagine a global pandemic. That was not on my list of risks that we were budgeting for at that time. So you can't predict everything, but we need to be aware of all the risks that we can reasonably be aware of, and the board needs to feel confident that we've thought through them and are managing for them appropriately. So I do want to say that unlike last year, I guess I said this at the beginning, I would classify the risks that I'm about to talk about as low to medium risks. Not so much because they're unlikely to happen, but because in whatever way these risks do manifest, they're unlikely to produce massive or unmanageable budget impacts. And in addition, for the most part, and again, this is unlike last year, these are pretty familiar risks, which make me more confident in our assessment of that risk. Last year, we had risks that could have had greater impacts and that were very unfamiliar, which is not a fun combination. So the open PPA contract, I think we've already talked about that is a risk. It is a risk that what we have included in the forecast is just wage increases equal to inflation with the continuing 5% cap and the continuing 1% floor. If we have salary increases beyond that, beyond the wage COLA, then we're going to have higher benefit expenses. There's also been some talk of bonuses, which are interesting because they create one-time costs instead of ongoing costs. And they don't impact as many different types of FPDR benefits as just salary increases do. So bonuses are less expensive for us, but they would still result in some costs. And then they kind of have the interesting impact of incentivizing retirements a year later because you get that 1-year bump in your final pay calculation, which would incentivize folks to retire a year later. So that is a risk. Additional COVID waves. So we've talked about this quite a bit as we've moved along here. So COVID has been impacting our budget primarily in 2 ways. Again, disability costs for sworn employees and overtime when the Police Bureau and Fire Bureau have to bring folks in on overtime to cover staffing while folks are out with COVID exposures or COVID infections. So your guess is as good as mine about the future of the pandemic. But even if COVID doesn't fade off into the sunset, as we might like, it doesn't seem very likely. So the forecast, even though we are assuming that even though COVID doesn't go away, that the overall COVID situation improves, at least from an FPDR financial point of view, for all the reasons that we just talked about, that we get better as a community at managing the disruptive impacts, that we have a mostly vaccinated workforce, and that all of those things will mean that fewer police officers and firefighters are going to have to miss work because of COVID. That's what we're assuming in this budget. Again, if that doesn't turn out to be true, we've got plenty of money in contingency to manage for that relatively small financial risk. We've already talked about the retire rehire program. I mean, the risk here is really just that the return of that program at police and the possible institution of it at fire will incentivize retirements beyond what we've budgeted for, which would increase our pension costs. But as we've already talked about, some of those higher pension costs would also be offset by lower PERS costs, since the retire rehires don't cost us anything on that front, at least. So those are 3 risks, a couple more risks. Police hiring, now we haven't talked about this during the presentation. This is kind of another perpetual risk over the last several years. So the Police Bureau generally hopes to hire more police officers than they actually can hire. So we usually don't budget to kind of their aspirational hiring number, but we do try to budget on the high end of realistic for Police Bureau hiring, which I think minimizes the risk that they're going to hire more than we plan for and send our PERS contributions way over budget. But again, past experience is not always a perfect guide to the future, and the Police Bureau may have a banner hiring year next year or the year after that. And if that's the case, we wouldn't have quite enough money in our PERS contribution budget. And then, the mix of new hires versus retire rehires does impact the balance of our expenses between pension costs and PERS contribution costs as well. Tax delinquency and compression, we talked about that a little bit earlier as well. This is the only really revenue side risk that I see.
I was about to say, Stacy, it would be really nice for you to take just a couple of minutes and relax your throat, get some water. Any questions from the board regarding this? Where's Catherine? Do you have any questions there, Catherine? No questions from Catherine?
I do have one question.
Oh, there we go.
But I'm not sure it's going to help Stacy rest her voice. So I will talk really slowly.
I'll sip more water.
My question is when you talk about contingency, as I look at the budget, I don't see a line item that's specifically contingency. So is that something that's built into each of the line items?
No, it is built in, and I could put up on my screen though, something that's got a little more detail in it if you want to see that. It's part of fund level requirements.
Oh, okay.
So it's rolled up in here, and it's $14 million. It's $14 million of this total in fiscal year in 23, and most of the rest of it is repaying tax anticipation notes.
Okay.
But okay.
That was going to be the question that I was going to ask, because when something like that, there's not enough money that is rolled up within these budgets. Is there an emergency meeting that allows you to do that? Or how can you do that without having to have an emergency meeting?
So this is, I mean, that's a great question. So when we have to draw on fund contingency, we don't have to come back to the board and ask for a draw on fund contingency. Because of the way Oregon local budget law works, we do have to get council's permission, which is kind of odd because they don't have budget approval.
Yeah.
I know that is an odd thing, but again, because we are a city fund, they still have to approve that draw on fund contingency. We've only drawn on fund contingency one time since I've been here, and that was last year. But certainly council raised no concern about that. But when you guys adopt the budget, because we're not legally required to come back to you and ask if we can draw on fund contingency, you are essentially telling us to feel free to draw on fund contingency if we need to. However, if the board doesn't like that, I have no objection to coming back at a board meeting, and I'll always let you know that we've drawn on fund contingency, but I have no objection to coming back and asking you before we do that. Before we do, I mean, we can see it coming. Usually, it's not usually an emergency. It's even last year. I mean, we could see that truck coming, for months. It's not an emergency situation.
Right. Well, I think you have the board's confidence in your ability to do that with great discretion.
All right. Thank you, Chair Carter.
Agreed.
Thank you for the water break also. The break and listening to me drone on and on, especially because I'm hoping that I'm inspiring fear and that everyone's really afraid of all of these risks that we face. Not really, because
people like me are just trying to absorb this. See, Catherine already is a leader in this, and so people like me trying to absorb everything. So I'm listening intently.
Yes. Well, I appreciate that. I can't imagine how hard it is to listen intently to a budget presentation of all things. I need to have more jokes. But Trustee McLeod, I do want to go back and answer your question because I used, when Sam and Kim were talking about COVID, I pulled up the chart on the retirements real quickly. And this forecast does include our 20 cushions.
It does. Okay.
Yes. So you can see why I was so what this is in this 59 number for the current year is the 38 that are actuarially predicted, like service retirements, plus one that we know is moving off of disability and onto pension. Okay. And then the plus the 20 cushions. So it is, it is low to think, are we really only going to retire 38 people this year? We've retired 24 to date, but there are no 27 pay dates in this current fiscal year. And when there are not 27 pay dates, that's why I feel like with the 20 cushions, I'm okay. Honestly, I'm a little more worried about fiscal year in 23, but that's part of why I threw the 20 cushions in this year, because then I get a full year of expense in my cushion by pretending that they retired this year.
Yeah.
Yes. So it sort of covers us across both of these fiscal years, and that it really covers us more in fiscal year in 23.
Okay, that makes sense.
Does that make sense? Okay.
It does. And your comment too that, with the wave of retirements, that 106 from last year, just that the number that might be eligible to retire has got to be depleted. So
yes,
that plus the margin of 20 seems.
But it also institutionalizes the kind of anticipation that would come and you have to go back again for another year into the budget. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that you guys see it that way. And so, you know, I'm especially after seeing 106 people retire in 1 year, you know, I'm still, although I have to say that I think we predicted 107 retirements last year and we hit 106. So, but it's so volatile that it does make me nervous, and it impacts our budget to a much greater degree than a lot of these other risks that we're talking about. So when we talk about fund contingency, you know, so you were asking where contingency lives. You know, it lives in its own line item as $14 million. However, we have built in a little bit of contingency into this pension budget with those 20 cushions. So that's like a little bit of extra contingency that is living in the budget.
Okay.
So let's talk about fund contingency and how the board feels about fund contingency, and if we think that where we want to go with this year. So I have, I should mention one other thing. We were talking about property tax delinquencies and compression loss. I think everyone knows that, you know, if we have assumed that delinquencies are going to return to their usual levels kind of slowly over the next couple of years, and we're going to assume that compression stays stable. If that doesn't happen, then we could come up short on property tax revenues. So, you know, this is another piece that if I were to pick one piece that I'm a little more nervous about, I would say it was this, because the economic recovery as we come out of this global pandemic and what that looks like, it feels more uncertain to me, you know, than a normal. I mean, all economic recovery feels uncertain, but at all points of the budget cycle, or not the budget cycle, the economic cycle the business cycle feel uncertain, but it feels a little more uncertain to me right now. How will property taxes, they've proved very resilient so far, but how does that look over the long run?
But Stacy, are you helped at all in terms of the economist's projections for employment? And does that help some?
Yes. Absolutely. And more than anything, we rely on the city economist, who is now Peter Husselman, who I believe came from Portland State, to give us good, you know, Portland specific forecasts. You know, of course, you know, most of the forecasts out there are bigger than Portland forecasts. So he is an economist. You know, I'm a finance person, which is a, you know, slightly different profession. He knows far more than I do about doing those kind of macroeconomic forecasts. So I really do rely on him, and I'm relying on his belief that, you know, that delinquencies are going to drop over the next couple of years, and that compression is going to stay the same, and that we're going to continue to see growth in the underlying properties in Portland. But, you know, he could be as wrong as anybody. And so, especially as it feels less certain to me than it has at any other point in my career what this looks like over the next couple of years. I'd
rather take his than to take political projections. So I think that you're living in a better space than if it was political.
Well, that's true. So I don't think, you know, unlike the, you know, presidents kind of trying to berate Fed chairs, I've never heard Mayor Wheeler try to berate the city economist into doing anything. So it's a pretty non-political. That would be funny. I probably wouldn't be funny to him, but so circling back then, the one risk that I did not put on the slide, and I perhaps should have, is inflation. You know, again, we have assumed, and I probably didn't put it on the slide because it is, again, not a major risk for next year's budget because we have built high inflation into next year's budget, but it is a risk in the out years because we have assumed, and again, this feels very uncertain, that inflation, more uncertain than it did 6 months ago, that inflation will drop in the long run back to under 3%. So that is a risk for the out years, but less of a concern in the budget year when we're talking about fund contingency. So I am recommending, so how do we manage all of this risk? So we have our 20 cushions in the pension budget, but mostly, you know, we try to make sure we have enough cash on hand to manage the fallout for whatever does come our way. And so that's what we use contingency for. So I am recommending that we return to something that is more like our usual contingency level, which is about 7% of operating expenses, which would be 14 million in the next fiscal year in 2023. Excuse me. So let me give you, I tried to give some examples here of what we could cover with that 14 million. We could cover all of this and have about $6 million left, about. So we could cover 20 additional retirements, and that's on top of the 20 cushion retirements built into the pension. So really we could cover 40 additional retirements. We could cover potential salary increases and bonuses in the new PPA contract. And I have some confidence in what I've used there because we've taken the highest, the biggest contract that we have seen, because we do costing to help the city and the union sometimes as well with their costing for the contract. So I can't talk about that publicly, but we've taken the biggest contract proposal on either side that we've seen and costed that out, and we could cover that as well with this 14 million. We could cover disability costs for an additional COVID surge, are in like the $1.5 million range, which is similar to what we experienced last year. And we could cover a slightly higher property tax delinquency rate and still have about $6 million left over. Is, you know, kind of when you think about, well, what does that $14 million buy me? If I make my best guesses about estimating costs for some of these risks, that's what $14 million would buy us. I do also want to say that fund contingency is not the only way we have to manage risk. We borrow money from our tax anticipation notes. We do have to repay that money in the same fiscal year, which is complicated because we can't replenish our money until the next fiscal year with the property tax levy. So that's not super helpful. But if we really did run out of money in the fund, we could also borrow from another fund. You know, the water funds and the infrastructure funds they're required to sit on a lot of cash for their bond covenants, but they are also allowed to loan some of it out. So we could arrange an interfund loan with another loan at the city if we became truly desperate and we would have to pay the prevailing, you know, interest rate, the market interest rate. We've never had to do that, but we could certainly do that as well. So that's kind of double secret, you know, fund contingency, I guess, would be to either borrow from another fund, or we could also just flat out borrow on the capital markets. We're extremely creditworthy. We always get very low interest rates on our TANs. We'd have to pay a little bit more for something that was longer term in nature, but that would always be possible as well. So what are the board's thoughts on that level of fund contingency?
Stacey, did I see where you said the total amount of interest rate, but you were looking at was 7%? I'm looking overall.
Oh, this 7%, yes, that's 7% of operating expenses.
Okay.
So it's, you know, you will hear a lot of funds talk about using like a 10% as a fund contingency. That gets pretty big for us. Like our expenses are fairly predictable compared to a lot of funds, because we are able to use actuarial, you know, techniques to forecast our pension budget and things like that. So 7% has kind of been our historic norm, but you will see other funds using as much as 10%.
So James, Catherine, any other board members have some questions, some comments?
Thank you, Chairman Carter. I do not have any questions at this point. I think in light of her forecast, I certainly agree with her recommendation. So,
Catherine?
I feel the same. I feel like we've had some good discussion on it, but I very much appreciate your looking to say, what would this 14 million buy us, and how much would it potentially leave over after covering some of these bigger risks that you've identified? I won't want to say bigger, but less certain, you know, or more difficult to predict. So that leaves me with great confidence, added to the fact that I know that the last thing you want to do is not have enough money. So you've built in, you know, enough conservatism here. So I'm comfortable with this, and I appreciate the discussion.
I'm certainly feeling comfortable about that. As I looked at your whole budget, and I thought that you were pretty conservative on your numbers. So I feel comfortable with that. And if there are no other comments, no other questions, I would propose that we would passed a contingency of 14 million, was it? I'm looking for the number.
Actually, Chair Carter, all that's required, although I'll let Kathy jump in here if we need to, is that I think you don't have to adopt the contingency separately. You can just adopt the whole. You can adopt the whole budget, including the contingency level. But I'm sorry, I paused there because I really did want to make sure the board was comfortable with that 14 million. It's kind of the one place that. It's kind of the one line item that I really want to make sure that, the board feels comfortable with. I understand you guys are probably not going to tear into our actuarial models for the pension projection or, argue with us about medical benefits or something like that. But the contingency is at that sort of policy level. And so I wanted to make sure that before we adopt the budget, that everyone is comfortable with that. But it sounds like everyone is. I haven't heard from Trustee McClary, but
I'll jump in. I'll first start by thanking you for taking the time to go through this so thoroughly. It's very helpful. And as the new one of the new members on this board here, I'm certainly in no position to question it. I am definitely comfortable with it. I appreciate all the effort that's gone into presenting this. And if I am correct in my understanding, the contingency should be in excess of what is needed at the end of the year. It just will be part of the reserve, the fund balance for next year. Is that correct? Yeah,
exactly.
Makes perfect sense to me.
Exactly. Okay.
Great. I'd like to move for adoption of the 2022-2023 budget. Second.
I'll second.
Can we hold off on before you do the adoption, Stacy, because there's a little bit of contingency to what they're approving. Could you go over that?
Oh, yes. Okay. I thought about jumping in on that. So I did want to mention future technical adjustments. So I always explain to the board that you guys are adopting the budget, you have exclusive authority to adopt the budget. However, when the mayor proposes his budget and council adopts their budget for the rest of the city, we sometimes have to make small technical tweaks to match up with the police and fire bureau budgets in places where those intersect. If there are any significant changes, either programmatically or financially, I will bring those changes back to the board. But if you can adopt the budget with the understanding that we have the authority to make those technical tweaks just to align with other bureaus' budgets, then that is always helpful to us.
I would not expect anything any differently. Any other board member?
Is there any examples that a layperson can understand from the technical adjustments?
Yeah, usually they are things that are so painfully boring. Like the Bureau of Technology Services will add a position that the mayor decided they could have to, do something that's citywide, and then everybody has to pay their share of that one person, and we have to increase our technology services interagency budget by $500. What is more consequential, let me give you an example of something more consequential that I would bring back to the board, would be that the mayor says, you know what, we're going to hire an extra 100 police officers next year. We're going to do something that will make that possible. Well, that's significant both programmatically and financially for us. And so then I would bring that back to the board because we would have to increase our budget substantially to match something like that. But if they add one position, you'll see a lot of talk in the budget of them adding positions at police or fire, taking them away. And our hiring projections are kind of independent of adding positions, especially at police where they have massive, vacancy levels anyway.
Okay, understood. Thank you.
Okay.
Sam, the reason I was not as worried about that as anything else, because whenever the final adjustments of this has to come through city council, there's going to always be some little tweaks and things that you have to take. And you guys have lived conservatively through this budget, and I'm comfortable with that. So we've had a second from Catherine. So I move the adoption of the 2022-2023 budget. All in favor? Thank you. Sam, the resolution number 543.
543. So Stacy will kick off her screen there. Okay, let me pull up my notes here. I'll go through some notes and I'll share a sort of fact sheet with you online. So the FPDR lease for its present office space ends April 30 of this year, 2022. In September, we discussed with the board our options of what we wanted to do and where we wanted to move the office to. So prior to that discussion in September, we conducted a review of new office space options, including local spaces, spaces in city-owned buildings, such as the Portland building downtown, or the 1900 building, which is on the PSU campus. We also looked at some options of additional space in the building that we're in now. One of the things that we were looking at on this review is to downsize, and I'll show you the fact chart here in a minute, where we have a lot of unused or poorly used space in what we're doing. We're going to be moving into, so we thought we were paying quite a bit for space that we didn't need. We're also, as part of the pandemic, everybody's learned how to telework. And once we settle down in and they allow bureaus back into the offices officially in the city of Portland, we're going to have a large number of our staff that is going to do hybrid work schedules where they're working predominantly at home. So again, we don't need quite as much space in the building that we've had. So after that review, the review showed that moving into a smaller space in our present building was our best option. And that's what we shared with the board back in September. So what's happened since then, we've begun lease negotiations with the landlord in the building that we're in. And we've also created what I call an office build / office move project plan. We have a good project manager who comes out from the city of Portland facilities department. She's done a lot of these moves for a lot of bureaus in the city, so she's very good at this and knows the detailed work with you. The lease negotiations have progressed quite a way. I'd like to say they're close to 95% done. And Kathy sent you a few days ago the lease documents, the drafts of those documents. Again, want to make sure those are draft, they aren't the final lease. And again, the substantive portions of the lease options are resolved. And so let me pull up a document that I can share with you. If I can find the right screen. I get this to go right. There we go. So you should see a full screen of that document. So the current space that we're in is 8,060 square feet. When we presented our estimate in September to the board, we were targeting about 5,200 square feet, nearly 3,000 feet less. Some uniquenesses about our office is the FPDR board meetings prior to 2007 were held in our office. So we have this conference room that's about 1,100 to 1,200 square feet. That's where the board is held. It's a massive conference room, and we don't need all that space or pay for that space. Also, the way the office is located, it tends to be located in a line, and so the hallways and stuff result in inefficient use of the space. So there's different ways that we have too much space. And right now, most everybody has a physical walled office, and we don't need those going forward, especially since a lot of people will be teleworking, won't be in the office as often. With that, so we come over here to the actual lease space that we targeted in the building is 5,300. So it's just a couple hundred square feet bigger than our initial estimate. The cost per square foot of what we are doing now, and the latest, because it goes up annually. So the latest time on that lease is at $29.02 per square foot. We estimated back in September at $33 a square foot, and the new lease amount is $33. So been effective there. And then you'll see the annual and monthly lease amounts. So I think that translates down to about $55,000 savings a year on the lease going into this location. Those cost per square footage rate is locked in. That will not change in the negotiations. So that's one of the key parts of the lease. So that has been set. And so that means the annual and monthly lease amounts are set also. The new lease term is 66 months. Seems like an odd amount of time. Usually, it's a 5.5 years. If you look at the second bullet point underneath the chart, you'll see that we pay no rent for the first 6 months. Then we pay rent for the remaining 60 months, the remaining 5 years. We do say that we're going to enter into the lease May 1 of 2022. That is still somewhat open because of the third bullet point we may not be ready for move-in on May 1 of 2022. There's a whole lot of issues going on with that. We've got COVID, which has made scarce for some of the labor that's needed to help move in. The supply chain issues, because some of the stuff, we're going to make cubes with it, so we have to buy the whole cube furniture, the cube walls. I think some of that comes from overseas, so we're at the whims of the supply chain and shipping on that. We've unfortunately have some experience with shipping of this in for another move of another bureau in the city, and some pieces are still waiting after 6 months of order. They're targeting that they can get those in a couple months. So, part of the construction is we have to build construction in there called the build out. So we're taking a few walls down and adding a few walls. So we've got to get enough contractors in to do it. So May 1 is a very tight deadline, probably won't be met. So we're negotiating a couple options with the landlord. The most ideal is they move the lease term out to starting July 1. So that would be the start of the 66 months. And they allow us to basically go to a month-to-month lease in our existing office, paying the same rate we do on a monthly basis. So that's what we're hoping that they do, but we'll have to wait and see. That's still part up to the negotiation. But again, the 66 months is set, and as well as the base cost per square foot rate is set. So that's the key part of the leases. Most of the negotiation left on the lease are minor things like discussing what about parking, some of the services they will offer to support us. I don't consider them substantial. We will negotiate to get the best options there. So I want a little bit more of build out and moving costs. These are not part of the lease. So, well, the first bullet may be, but for the most part, these, I just wanted you to be aware of what the status of the move was. So the build out cost does fall under the lease negotiation. The landlord will pay for what they call the turnkey build out. If it's very simplistic building, such as taking a wall down and adding new walls in, that's usually considered turnkey, and the landlord will pay for it. But we do have some special requirements going into the office, and they're negotiating, are they special enough to be considered non-turnkey, or are they turnkey? We'll go that. One of the costs that we're doing is we're adding some security to the entryway to where we'll have bullet resistant sheetrock, bullet resistant glass at the reception area. And that adds to the cost. We'll probably have to absorb that additional cost for the specialty materials to do that. And there's a few other things in there. This is, this can add up to $20,000 or $30,000, $40,000 difference in there, depending upon how it's done. So we're negotiating through that right now. We do have a broker who's very experienced. We worked with him before 5 years ago when we renewed our existing lease. He knows everything in and out. He's already been pushing and pulling with them. He's gotten us some of the initial first build out costs, which are creating the plans. We have to have somebody that actually writes the blueprints for that. He got the building landlord to accept 100% of the cost of creating those plans. So that's what he's doing. He's doing a lot of work for us, and he knows we want, and he will be making sure he includes as much of that in the lease as possible. Now, not something that falls outside of the lease is all the technology setup that we need in the office. We have to get the phones wired in, the network wiring in so we can hook our computers. We have some special security needs, such as cameras and some special locks on doors, et cetera. Anything technology-wise falls under us. It's outside the lease, and it's our responsibility to pay for. Fortunately, our BTS, our Business Technology Services Bureau, has been through moves before, so they know this stuff in and out, what has to be there. One advantage of staying in this building we have is that we have to have external wiring that goes outside the building and technically connects us to the city. That already exists because we're already in the building. Matter of fact, they just pull some of the wire down out of the wall and plug it into our floor. So that's a big advantage for us. So it's only internal office wiring and network setup, none of the exterior going through there. And that just sheer fact seeing the building, that can save us $20,000 or $30,000 and having to wire streets and everything else. Mm-hmm. As I said earlier, furniture, we are moving into a cube environment out of a hard wall office. So we have to have entire new furniture, new cube panels, everything like that, because very little of the furniture we have will translate into that new environment. So we're presently, or probably about 80% of the way there, determining what the furniture needs are. And once we do that, we'll have an estimate. And then we can go up and down on the estimate and what we need once we get those costs. The actual move costs, which gets us, how do we actually physically get ourselves or files or filing cabinets and other stuff out, down 2 floors in the same building, we'll have to pay that cost. Fortunately, being the same building, that should save quite a bit more than moving to another building. We also have office surrender costs. When we surrender the office or turn it back to the landlord, we have to have it cleaned out to a certain level. It means we can't leave any furniture, any stuff in there. We may have to remove specialty wiring and specialty features we put in the office. So that's being negotiated. Again, we're trying to see if we can streamline that process and those costs as much as possible. So what we're looking today is you are giving permission for me to continue to negotiate the lease, keeping in mind all the substantive stuff has been resolved and are in the documents that I sent you, and allow me to initiate the finalization of that lease and get it ready, what I call ready for signing. And once it's ready for signing, we then forward it to the city council, which has to be the one to approve the lease. Because even though it's our lease, it is done through the city, and the city's it carries the risk with it. They'll transfer it to us, of course, but they do it. So that's why they sign off on the lease at city council. So anybody have any questions on that and on what we're doing with the lease and what we're asking you to do today? Because you saw on the first slide, this is the costs. The costs are on the slide for the lease itself. And that's what we're projecting. I do not believe those costs will change at all when we do the final lease.
Were these costs included in the projected cost that Stacy was talking to us about? Is any of this rolled up in that?
Yes. So but in fact, I did not include the 6 month of free rent in next year's budget. I budgeted to an estimate. I budgeted $185,000 for rent next year, and it's going to be considerably less than that if we get 6 months free. So I've at this point over budgeted a little bit for rent, a lot for rent next year. A little in the context of our whole budget, but a lot for rent.
Okay.
And all the move costs that we talked about are in this year's budget, because they'll be incurred before July 1.
Oh.
So that won't be in next year's. The lease costs will be in next year's budget, but the move costs are in this year's budget.
Okay. Question, comments from other board members? Didn't we talk about this? Please go.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry about the delay. Sam, my only question is with respect to the $33 per square foot. I'm assuming that is a competitive market rate, right, in the downtown Portland area?
Yes, it is. Again, that's one of the things our brokers did. We do ask them to look at it being competitive. You can see it's a big jump from the $29 to the 33, which you probably caught your eye. A couple of reasons why that number is higher. The $29 cost was set 5 years ago. And they set the lease amount in certain percentages of increase. Like the new lease we sign is at 3%. Pre-pandemic, there was a lot of demand for office space downtown, and they probably would have added more to that if they knew this was coming through. So that 29 was a very good rate that we had, and below probably a little bit of market rate for the building. Also, in the past couple of years, the landlord, or the older landlord, did a lot of upgrades to the building. It was built in 1974. Some of the features and amenities in the building were dated back to the 1970s or the 1980s, maybe lucky 1990s. So they upgraded the HVAC unit significantly. They brought the elevators from 1974 electronics and mechanics all the way up to 2020 electronics and mechanics, a giant leap, that all the common lobby areas were changed and upgraded. And even in the main lobby area, they forego some office space and actually made it into a lounge with a coffee shop. So they're trying to make it more competitive and looking to the community. So again, that puts some upward pressure on the rates. Going forward, and there's a lot of discussion of what the impact COVID's going to have on rates, because there are a lot of other people like us trying to downsize their space because they're not going to need it as much for people teleworking, that type of thing. That it's risky to try to guess and make projections with that, because sure, it may suppress prices for a few years, but when the economy gets going and everything stabilizes, it's COVID, and you could see the rates go back up. So our broker felt this was a good rate. We're considered on the outer ring of the downtown. So these are the cheapest rates you get in the downtown area. And he feels that it's good. He's seen rates in a couple buildings that are just a block or two away from us go up much higher than this, because they've put a lot of money into their buildings to make them fancier and more appealing to leases. So he felt this was a good rate.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Further questions, comments? Didn't we pass on this in September and you're just updating us, Sam?
September was the go-ahead that we presented the options we wanted to go for. And one of the options was to negotiate a lease on a smaller space in our present building.
Right.
So what we're doing is we're negotiating the lease and asking you to come back and approve basically the lease, give me the final say to get the last little pieces of the lease put together, authorizing me to do that so we can sign the lease. So the first one was what we were going to do. Now we're doing it. And the first step we need to get done is get the lease and the commitment from the landlord. And that's what we're asking you to approve is the lease and allowing me to complete the final negotiations on the lease before I turn it over to City Council for approval.
Okay, okay.
I think you just answered what my only question was, and that is, after our approval to proceed to wrap up the negotiation, is the city required to get involved? And it sounds like yes, their council needs to review and approve it as well.
Yes, they will.
Okay.
Are you moving the budget, Catherine? Is that what you're doing?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear your question.
Were you moving the motion?
I am certainly happy to do that. I will make a motion that we approve resolution number 543 to proceed with the FPDR office space lease negotiation.
Second?
Second.
Cal, second. So move. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye, thank you. So move. Resolution number 543. So information action items are next. Is that you, Sam?
That's me. Let me get back to my thing here. Well, actually, the first one is you get to hear from Stacy again. Summary of expenditures.
I'll keep it to water. One sentence. The board expenditure report is in front of you, and that extends through December of 2021. Everything, nothing really exciting to report. I would point out that we haven't spent any money on PERS contributions yet this year. And that is just like, kind of harkens back to when I was talking about that police and fire administrative consolidation. They actually bill us for those quarterly. It doesn't happen automatically through our payroll system for reasons I won't go into. And so I think that just reflects kind of the staffing transition issues they're having, that we haven't been able to pay them back for any of their PERS contributions yet this year. So that's mildly interesting. Okay.
Item number 2.
So I'm sorry, so they're late on that bill, is what it sounds like.
Yeah. Yes, police did turn in their first quarter PERS contributions, but not in time to get it into December. But we haven't gotten anything from fire yet. But Trustee McClary, I'll say that is hardly their fault. I think they're down to like one person over there. Over at fire. It is not at all a case of incompetence, or it is a case of staffing shortages and this transition crossover with this new Office of Community
Thank you.
Safety. Yeah.
Franco, are you being seen for a reason? I was just asking Franco if he was being seen for a reason.
Oh no, I just thought I'd turn my camera on now that the presentation was over.
Okay. Item number 3, updates. Sam.
It's actually item 2, the board meeting location and city vaccine policy for volunteers. That's not important now since the governor extended her state of emergency till the end of June. basically what we're going to say is because of when that was supposed to expire the end of this December, and that would have forced us to have the discussion on these two topics. I don't, we're going to push this off till March, but a little bit more of how we want to conduct and where we want to conduct future board meetings. Then also we have a city vaccine policy for volunteers, which impacts the three of you, doesn't impact Kyle or Christopher because they're city employees, but the three of you would. But we'll go over that in March. We don't need to do that now if we're not under any time pressure for it.
Number 3.
So number 3, some updates. I'm going to throw a few things at you with that. So I was going to share a screen real quickly here just so this here, what you're looking at is just because we were talking COVID, so I thought I'd bring this claim up just to show you the COVID numbers that we had. Here's the huge spike that we had back in November and December of 2020. That was a massive one. The huge spike by fire, which is the red line here, was everybody was in close proximity in the stations, and there was before they had any real, this caught up with everybody before we really had any preventative actions to be taken to stop that spread. You see a small blip here, the blue, and police had it too. I think once, Fire Bureau did a tremendous job of changing how people interacted in stations and how people did PPEs on the scenes, everything. You saw a huge drop. And then you come through the summer months here, not much. A little pickup here in August, but you can begin to see this last pickup here in November, December, and January. Here, this is the Omicron stuff. It is generating, even though it doesn't have the huge spike, it has a lot of claims over this period. If you look at the blue line here, we now have more police COVID claims submitted this month than we had back in the peak in December of 2020.
Wow.
So the police is one that's taken a big hit. Fire, we've got an increase, but it's not as big. Obviously, you can see it's much lower. But this has generated a lot of claims coming through, which puts a lot of pressure on the claims people. We're going to see, we saw a record number of claims. You remember the state of FPDR, this brought in record number of claims last fiscal year. This here is going to bring in another large wave, not as high as that one, but this I imagine will be the second highest year that we've had in claims. So a lot of congratulations and a lot of support for our disability people here. And this ripples on through the finance staff because they're the ones that have to make sure the benefits get out the door. So it's been just quite a bit of work. So I wanted you to just see visibly what we talked about when you were talking about COVID, what's happening to us. And hopefully we'll see the spike go down like the country's beginning to see it go down, but we'll keep our fingers and we'll continue to monitor this graph forever until it really becomes to the point to where it just becomes background thing, but we haven't reached that yet. Okay, so the next quick topic to go over. I just want to give you some update on some contract approvals the board gave us earlier this year. In November, the board approved FPDR to pursue some managed care organization contracts with Kaiser Permanente, Managed Healthcare Northwest, and Providence. The Kaiser and Managed Healthcare Northwest contracts are completed, they're signed, and they're up and operational, which is very positive. Providence is taking a little bit more time to iron out because this is the first time they've worked with FPDR and worked, I think, and so we're just trying to get some things going. We fully expect it to be approved in the next 2 or 3 weeks and get them assigned and on board with that. Last September, you all approved a contract with Online Business Systems to provide support for our database and other technology that we have in the Bureau. The contract is completed and signed. And we were able to reduce the not to exceed amount from the $750,000 that you approved to $385,000. Significant decline. We went back and challenged some of the numbers they had given us and realized that the status quo number of $750,000 was not correct. So we got some savings out of that contract. So there's some positive news there. Next quick topic is the 2022 short legislative session begins February 1st. next week and ends March 7th. So this is a short one. It lasts just barely over 30 days. I will be looking at all the bills presented this year to see if there's any impact on FPDR. And so real quickly, what I look for are 5 or 6 particular items. One, is there anything in there that could directly impact the funding of the plan? Predominantly, are there any property tax changes? No indication that there will be here, but we're monitoring that constantly because people don't like Measure 5 and they're trying to change it, and that could potentially have a significant impact on us. I also look at anything that will change our FPDR 1 and 2 retirement benefits, the ones that we pay out of our fund. We have had a few items in the past. Fortunately, none of them real major, but we do have to adhere to them. One was a change in how we treat alternate payee, which is a synonymous term with a divorced spouse. They get special payment and special treatment, and the state statute changed that a while back. And then we also have the tax offset benefit. Since retirement benefits are taxable in the state of Oregon, they've created this tool to where people get a little bit increased benefit. We can talk more about that at a future meeting, more detail on that, but that was something that they changed how to administer that last session. We track what's happening in PERS. Remember, our FPDR 3 people are covered by PERS. Not that we can change that, but we just like to monitor and be aware of it. We're also looking at impact to employer and employee contributions. Are they going to increase them or change how they're done? Because again, we do pay those contributions for that. We look at legislation that impacts workers' compensation. Our FPDR disability plan is an approved substitute for the state workers' compensation system, but occasionally they will pass laws that affect the state workers' compensation system and put a clause in there and say that also impacts our plan. The most recent ones we had were the PTSD, the heart, lung, and firefighter cancer presumptions. I think we did the heart, lung last year, PTSD 2 or 3 years ago. So we had to modify our plan to be in compliance with the state statute. This session, they are looking to add cancers to the presumption, firefighter cancer presumption list. I'll talk over that more on that in just a minute. I also look at other bills to see how they possibly could impact FPDR. Will it impact my ability to hire and retain my existing staff? Will it just change other odds and ends that we do? One that they passed, I think, year before last was change the public meetings, now requiring that all public meetings have an electronic component. And so that does impact our public meeting, and we'll talk more about that when we start talking about going back potentially to in-person meetings. The bill that's coming up for cancer presumption they're adding bladder cancer and female reproductive cancers to the list. We've made our position known that we support the bill, but however, we have concerns that there's no data to support the inclusion of all the female reproductive cancers. We're not going to make an issue of that, and it's not going to change our support for the bill. Although a couple other organizations that ensure firefighters and police officers, not the city of Portland's firefighter and police officers, have made some big pitches along that line, but we'll just stand back and let things go as they may. I have a feeling, knowing the political flow of this bill will be approved during the session. As I go through bills, if there's any bill particular concerns, I do work with the city of Portland's Office of Government Relations to determine the best way to let the legislature know our position on the bill. And in the past, I've testified it in front of the Management Labor Action Committee. This is a group advisory committee, excuse me, it's a state legislation, it's a state statutes created this committee to look at all workers' compensation bills and weigh in on it and give their opinion to the legislature. I've testified there a couple times in the past. I've also in the past testified in 2 legislative committees. I don't anticipate doing that this time, but we'll see. So any questions on the legislation issues that are coming up? Okay, one last thing here that's coming up that could potentially impact FPDR is the District Council of Trade Unions, which is a organization that represents several trade unions in the city. Pardon me, my dog's making noise in the back, which represents several unions in the city. The DCTU members voted to authorize a strike last week. So far, the DCTU has not notified the city of their intent to strike. And should they notify the city, the strike could begin 10 days after that notice to the city. Presently, some discussions are continuing between the city and DCTU. The reason why I'm paying a lot of attention to this is 5 of our 17 positions are members of DCTU, so 30% of our staff at worst could choose to strike. And so we've been working hard, Kim, Stacy, and I, to make plans to continue full operations during the strike and ensure there's no impact on our ability to pay benefits and offer service to our members. I'll let you know should the strike be approved and what's happening at that point. We don't know. The union hasn't taken any stance so far of telling the city the strike is on. So that's a quick update to everything I have. Any questions on any of those topics?
No questions?
Okay.
Sam, is this the conclusion? I don't see anything else on today's agenda.
I think we've gone through plenty today, unless you want Stacy to go for round 2 or round 3. So.
Oh, thank you. We want Stacy to have plenty of water so she can be really, really refreshed for the next go round.
Yeah.
If there are no further questions, then I move for closure of our meeting today. Any other question before closure? Thank you guys always for great presentations, and I hope things continue to go well for us all. Bye now.
Thank
See you all later. Thank you much. Have a good one.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Take care.